Moving on, we're going to start looking at customizing the service layer via overriding OSGi service references. So one use case for this might be something like replacing the Liferay core component service reference with your custom implementation. So here, what we're seeing is OSGi @reference annotation, and what it does is injects a component reference into the calling component. So here in this little snippet of code, what we have are these @reference annotations, and it's basically bringing in other classes that we reference. How do we know which implementation gets injected? So an OSGi container actually allows multiple service implementations to coexist. And the way that the selection of implementations is chosen is based on the service implementation component's service.ranking property value. The @reference annotation attributes, we'll go ahead and list all of these. So service.ranking allows you to define a priority or an order for a service implementation. The higher values get precedence, and the default value is 0. So the effectiveness of the service implementation depends on referencing a component's reference attributes, and in the case of static reference policy, the OSGi bundle startup order in the container. Taking a look next, we're going to see a service.ranking example. So here in the @component annotation, we have a property, and we're listing the service.ranking as an integer of 100. So it's very high up on the ranking scale. Introducing an @reference attribute. Reference targets allow you to query the service implementation by its component properties, and it's all LDAP query syntax. So for example, what we have here is an Elasticsearch index writer, and inside of the Elasticsearch index writer class, we have target equals search engine impl equals Elasticsearch inside of the reference annotation. Similarly, inside of the Elasticsearch spellcheck index writer, we have a property which is search.engine.impl equal to Elasticsearch. So we have 4 reference cardinalities. Those 4 are mandatory, optional, multiple, and at least 1. Mandatory means that the reference has to be satisfied, which means both available and injected, for the component to start. Mandatory is the default cardinality. Optional means that the reference is not required for the component to start and work. Multiple means that the reference is not required, but multiple resources may satisfy the reference, and the component will take all of them. And at least 1 is similar to multiple, but at least 1 reference is required for the component to start. Keep in mind that when using multiple options, a setter method has to be defined. For reference policies, we have static and dynamic. For static, the reference is required, and the component will not be notified of alternative services as they become available. That's the default option. For dynamic, the reference is not required, and the component accepts new references as they become available. For reference policy options, we have reluctant, which means that for a single reference cardinality, new available references will be ignored, and for multiple reference cardinalities, new reference potentials will be bound. We also have greedy. As new reference potentials become available, the component will bind to them. Here we have an example of some of the attributes for the reference annotation. We have bind, cardinality, policy, policy option, service, and unbind. Which attributes do we actually want to use? So the default options are reference policy.static and policy option.reluctant. This means that by default, the @reference won't get notified of available implementations after the activation, the service.ranking is not effective, and the component startup order defines which implementation gets injected. Some other @reference attributes include things like bind, which is the name of the bind method for the reference, the field, which is the name of the field for this reference, field option, which is the field option for this reference, and those include things like replace, which replaces the field value with a new value whenever there are changes to the bound services, and update, which updates the collection referenced by the field if there are changes to the bound services. Continuing on, we have name, which is the name of this reference, scope, which is the scope for the reference, service defines the service class name for the reference, unbind is the event method for the reference, and updated is the updated event method for the reference. Next, we're going to go over some of these static and reluctant references. Override static and reluctant reference. Overriding is possible even with a static and reluctant reference policy. This is the direct OSGi container configuration. That takes us to the end of this lecture. The service ranking is an OSGi component property that defines the priority of service components among the components implementing the same service. Target attributes allow you to filter the service implementation to be injected. Reference cardinality defines whether a reference has to be satisfied for a component to be able to activate. The reference policy defines whether an injected service reference can be replaced dynamically. And the policy option provides more granularity for the dynamic injection policy.